Yakuza games are still a great time, and like we said, who knows, maybe we'll be back again soon talking about them. Maybe I need to get drunk again. That'll help me decide.
Kiwami 1 review, baby!
What the fuck?
The first Yakuza game was a major gamble for the series' creator, Toshiro Nagoshi. Sega was hesitant to accept his idea due to its premise about organized crime, along with worries about it being too specific of a demographic. Nagoshi put his employment at Sega on the line. If the game wasn't a success, he would resign.
Thankfully, though, the game ended up being a success, and Nagoshi would keep his position. Nowadays, he's no longer involved with Sega, but that's besides the point, and his legacy behind effectively birthing this franchise will definitely not be forgotten, regardless of who takes the reins going forward.
The first Yakuza game definitely shows its age, but it still holds up well enough, with a gripping crime plot, flashy combat, and a lively overworld for its time. But neither of us have PS2s, and the original game was never ported to modern consoles outside of Japan, so...
Released a year after Yakuza 0, and using the same engine as that game, Yakuza Kiwami takes the original PlayStation 2 classic and modernizes it for the better and for the worse at points, depending on who you ask. Regardless, this game was a surprise, I'm sure, for many fans of the series, since Yakuza 5 was released in 2012, and we had to once more wait for the next installment. But at the very least, they had good games to keep them occupied while 6 was in development. In fact, it's partially thanks to Zero's success that Kiwami even exists. So, yeah, there was another bonus in Zero's favor, but, I mean, we already praised that game enough in the last video, so...
Does Kiwami serve as a good remake of the original Yakuza? And how well does it hold up as a game on its own merits? Let's talk about that. Yakuza Kiwami uses the same engine as Yakuza 0 did, so the combat between the games is mostly the same. So if you're a fan of Zero's combat, you'll mostly be getting the same thing here. A ton of variety with the combat stances, a huge amount of special moves to pull off with the heat actions, and enough little touches to spice up combat, such as the usage of weapons, both in stores or picked up during fights themselves. This makes for a very satisfying time whenever you're beating up enemies, but there's still a few changes to the combat in this game.
For one, the Dragon and Beast styles are more watered down by comparison, and while the former has a reason due to the story, and you are able to power that up as the game goes on thanks to a mechanic we'll discuss later, Beast was kinda surprising since it was one of the main fighting styles. But for my playthrough, it was even easier to be dropped out of an attack by the tiniest thing than it was in Zero, and against some bosses like Majima, it's more of a hindrance than something helpful since it tends to be too slow to land a hit. Sure, I personally didn't like the style in Zero, but to see it worsened and not improved is a shame.
Personally, I didn't even notice the Beast style being watered down on my playthrough, and that's mostly because of how the character progression for Kiryu has changed. Rather than using money to unlock abilities, you have a variation of the EXP system for most RPGs. You gain experience points through various tasks, be it combat, side quests, hell, even eating at restaurants. Filling the EXP bar all the way gets you a level, which you can then spend on abilities for the Brawler, Rush, or Beast stances. While I miss how well the leveling up through money as a method tied into the world of Yakuza 0, this new system made playing as Kiryu way more fun for me. Don't get me wrong, he was still fun to play as in Zero, but he always felt somewhat stiff and clunky compared to Majima. And that was mainly because I wanted to conserve money for other stuff like pocket car racing and the real estate sub-story. But now that I don't need to use money to level him up, Kiryu felt so much more fluid and powerful, since I had far more skills for him here than I did in Zero.
And you will certainly need those new skills, because one thing they added to the combat is that certain enemies will heal themselves, and you need to use particular heat actions to stop that and or to defeat certain enemies. It's annoying at first, but you will eventually figure it out, and it becomes satisfying as hell to basically bitch slap the enemy for cheating. Only we can heal during a match, you son of a bitch.
So, on paper, it would sound like we find Kiwami's combat better than Zero overall, and in a sense, we do, but there's one thing about the combat that can massively kill the fun at times: the enemy AI. Enemies and bosses are much more annoying here than in Zero. They frequently dogpile on you, making it difficult to get combos going, are always able to get an extra hit in when you're knocked to the ground, no matter how fast you mash, and sometimes they'll just say, "Nope, your attack's due to random super armor." Look, I'm all for making games more difficult, but this comes off as cheap rather than a legit challenge. It's not bad enough to completely ruin the combat. Like I said, it's still really satisfying, but it's still a frequent annoyance and turns what could have been the best combat in the franchise into something more middle of the road.
Trust me, it's not the worst thing to happen to the Yakuza games combat-wise, and honestly, I'd rather take this than the block-happy BS of 3. I just finished drinking liquid flames to drown out the memories of that experience. God. But yeah, that's honestly the worst things about the combat in Kiwami, and if that's the worst thing it has going for it in terms of combat, it's probably a good sign in terms of this game's quality.
Well, there is another big problem I have with this game. Now, Kiwami has a good amount of stuff to do. Several sub-stories, a couple hostesses at cabaret clubs, fun mini-games, and a new system called...
We'll get to that.
But coming off the heels of 0, and hell, even 5 back in 2012, this game just feels so empty by comparison.
Now, to play Hades' advocate, the original game didn't have much to do in terms of subquests when compared to 0 and 5, and the story is a lot more focused, so it prioritizes you doing that than dicking around in Kamurocho. What?
Even Kamurocho on its own in Kiwami 2, or most of the individual cities from 5, felt like there was more to do for extra content than the entirety of Kiwami 1, where they managed to include more detailed sub-stories, business side stories, and even story arcs involving mentors. So I don't see why Kiwami 1, which has the same engine as 5 and 0, couldn't have had a little bit more. And I wouldn't mind quite as much if the sub-stories in Kiwami were more fleshed out. But man, most of these are so one and done. As an example, one sub-story involves people pretending you broke their bones by running into them too hard. You scare them off and that's it. This gets repeated 3 times.
And what sucks about this particular side quest is that it was in the original Yakuza game, and it had the same issue there too. This could have, and frankly should have, been expanded upon, or at least made more interesting, but they just didn't. What a shame.
A large amount of sub-stories fall under this too. Kiryu comes across a crime or a con, a brief exchange of dialogue happens, then the fight, boom! It's over. Not a lot of entertaining stuff happens, not a lot of depth from the characters involved in the sub-story is shown, it's just done. Now, there are some interesting sub-stories here. For example, there's a sub-story where someone unknowingly hires Kiryu to assassinate himself. That was pretty funny. There's a few sub-stories involving supporting characters in the main story that are a fun time, and there's a set of entirely new sub-stories revolving around pocket car racing, coupled with a bunch for the characters from that side story in 0 reappearing all grown up. That was really cool to see. However, overall, unlike 0 where entertaining sub-stories were almost everywhere you went, here it's more of a few gems buried underneath a ton of forgettable distractions.
On that note, let's talk about said distractions. Well, Kiwami adds in the cabaret from 0. Kind of. It's more so just incorporating the talking to hostesses portion, but it is technically there. They also expanded upon the Coliseum in this game to where you can access it at any time after the unlock and can use it to farm points for items and the like, which is pretty cool. This game also adds in the bug wrestling section, which is basically just the women wrestling stuff from 0, but they're dressed up as bugs. Because potatoes or something. And...
We've been putting this off for long enough. Time to talk about what's by far the most iconic and probably most controversial addition to Yakuza Kiwami. The Majima Everywhere system. Remember how I said EXP is used to level up the Brawler, Rush, and Beast styles? Well, to level up the Dragon style, there's only 2 ways to gain skills. Training with Komaki for a handful of them, and of course, Majima himself. Throughout various persons in the game, Majima will roam around Kamurocho looking for a fight. Sometimes he'll just be walking like an NPC, sometimes he ambushes you while he's hiding, sometimes he interrupts fights you're having. God, that's annoying. And sometimes entire scripted scenarios will play out, such as him pretending to be a bartender and overcharging you, to him faking a zombie apocalypse, all as an excuse to fight Kiryu. He'll even challenge you in minigames from time to time. The more requirements revolving around Majima you fulfill, the more skills for the Dragon style that you unlock.
Yeah, fuck the flowery pros, I'm stepping into Tiger Drop this one-eyed shit. I absolutely despise this system, and it got so fucking tiring to deal with some of his antics as I went through the game. Yes, I get the in-story reason, and it's a good one, but effectively turning him into Mr. Shakedown by swapping out money for XP is completely the wrong decision personally. And the longer it went on, the more I wanted him to leave me alone. What especially doesn't help is that even after you get everything in the Dragon style unlocked and beat him for the last time, he still does the everywhere shtick. Excuse me? What? You got what you wanted, you one-eyed freak! And yes, I know this gameplay mechanic was inserted because of Majima's popularity, but there were honestly better ways to execute that! But I'm probably in the minority on this one, so more power to you if you enjoy the system. I'm just not one of them, and now I'm gonna upgrade my drink to liquid napalm. Remember, don't try this totally not fake drink at home.
Tell us how you really feel. In all seriousness, my opinion on the Majima Everywhere system is a bit more mixed. While I certainly get annoyed at times with how often he interrupted me, the fights against Majima tended to be pretty fun, and him switching between his fighting stances from Zero was a good way to spice things up. But moreover, it made for entertaining moments. Seeing the lengths Majima will go in order to make Kiryu a more proper rival was a blast, and I liked how the rivalry extended to ways other than fighting. But moreover, it also helped to provide more insight on Majima as a character. A handful of times, before or after the fight, there'll be some genuinely deep moments between Majima and Kiryu. Majima cross-dressing and acting as a hostess is incredibly silly, of course, but it also leads to the two of them simply talking about their times as business owners back in Zero. Or when right after Majima pretends to be a stripper, Kiryu talks about how he's truly grateful for what Majima is doing, and Majima drops him for saddling for a future Yakuza character. However, my biggest issue with the Majima Everywhere system isn't about the system itself, but it just doesn't mess well with the main story. See, as the first Yakuza game, it's natural for some characters to be different from how they are today. Nowhere is that more clear with Majima. Majima is outright cruel and sadistic in the main story, from trying to impale a thug on a whim, to brutally beating a subordinate of his possibly to death for a really petty reason, to making a young woman think he's gonna murder her if she doesn't become his girlfriend. I'm not saying you can't portray Majima like this, especially since it's a remake of the first game, but it makes it a massive stretch for me to believe Kiryu would be so chummy with him minutes afterwards. Hell, it outright undermines moments in the main story. Majima taking a knife for Kiryu in the main story is nowhere near as impactful when you can just casually talk to him 5 minutes later. It even undermines a moment exclusive to Majima Everywhere, where Majima seemingly drowns to death after being shot. But that amounts to nothing because you can encounter Majima immediately afterwards, so what was the point of the death fake out? Ugh. All in all, Majima Everywhere was a fun idea, and it certainly has its great moments, but its execution tends to be messy, or as my partner demonstrated, outright rage-inducing.
But there is one thing they added to this remake, and that is in the story. Was it executed better, or was it rage-inducing like Majima Everywhere? God, I hope not.
So, let's start by talking about what the story directly takes from the original game. Kiryu, on the cusp of becoming a patriarch of his own family, takes the fall for his best friend, Nishiki, after Nishiki kills their patriarch, Shohei Dojima, when he tried to rape their childhood friend, Yumi Sawamura. Kiryu spends a decade in jail and is expelled from the Tojo clan. When he's released, he finds out that Nishiki's gone off the deep end, an empty position for the 4th Tojo clan chairman is up for grabs, and basically the entire criminal underworld is after a missing 10 billion yen that's been stolen from the Tojo clan. And somehow, that missing money's connected to a little girl who's apparently the niece of Yumi. However, despite having a huge role in the story, Yumi's characterization and role in the game is terrible. One thing we admittedly didn't bring up in our Yakuza 0 video was that despite it being a prequel and having several characters from other games show up in either the main story or in sub-stories, Yumi never appears and is barely even mentioned.
And that becomes a problem here, because the story treats her as such an important keynote in the story, but she's either treated as a damsel in distress, missing for most of the game, and then goes to the Shadow Realm at the end. I'm sorry, what? Why should I care about this character? At least Nishiki and Kiryu have characterization thanks to this game in Zero, and even the bartender has more of a character than Yumi, and she's also death fodder after a while. This is especially frustrating because Kiwami adds in a bunch more stuff for Nishiki's characterization, but Yumi gets dick. No further expansion on her character, little to any chemistry with Kiryu, and that is a major annoyance considering that one of the opening missions for this remake is for Kiryu to get a goddamn ring for Yumi, implied for romantic reasons on top of being a birthday gift, and all of that effort and annoyance of having to run back and forth for the ring meant dick, because after we get the ring, the original events of the story kick in. So, this game wants me to care so much about Yumi and her importance to not only Kiryu, but also the story, but I can't, because she is barely a character in the story that tries to frame her as a central piece. Frankly, if you wanted to have her as such a central piece of the story, you could have expanded on her character just as much as Niski, or cut her out of the main focus if you're not going to do anything with her properly. I'd rather have a no-ass attempt than a half-assed one.
However, while Yumi was a pretty weak character, the rest of the supporting cast are really enjoyable. They all bounce off Kiryu incredibly well, and have a fair share of memorable moments. Date, Yuya, and Shinji are absolute bros. The florist added a unique flair with his underground civilization, and it helps that there are several sub-stories or even outright chapters dedicated to expanding on some of their characters. And of course, I can't bring up the supporting cast without talking about Haruka. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed her in this game. Yeah, you need to save her a lot, but she's also calm, mature, and surprisingly clever for a 9-year-old. But she still has the innocence and wonder of a child, and the moments where she bonds with Kiryu are outright adorable. You can even do activities with her to fill up a gauge in the post-game to get some awards. Haruka deserves all the happiness.
Speaking as a parent, at least in my reality,
we get it, you're from the future!
It's nice to see moments like these with Kiryu and Haruka. It's wholesome.
The conspiracy itself is also pretty interesting. Finding out more about how deep the rabbit hole goes, both in regards to the missing yen and for Kamurocho as a whole, was cool to see unfold. And man, can this game nail the atmosphere! The action is delightfully over the top, the tragic moments hit hard, and the moments of tension constantly have you on the edge of your seat. It's not quite as exciting or gripping as Zero's story, but it's still a fun time. As for villains of this game, they're hit or miss. Niski is great, for reasons we'll get to, and Majima is naturally a blast, but the others range from serviceable but generic, to really forgettable, to ugh. Okay, we're about to enter massive spoiler territory here, so here's a heads up if you want to skip it. Anyway, Kyohei Jingu is one of the worst video game villains I have ever seen. Jingu is a corrupt politician who's the owner of the missing 10 billion yen. He's also the father of Haruka and the former lover of Yumi. Yeah, as it turns out, Yumi never had a sister and is actually Haruka's mother, not aunt. Jingu was about to get married to the daughter of the Prime Minister, so to avoid a political scandal, he ordered the deaths of Haruka and Yumi to cover up loose ends. Sounds like a scumbag, which I can appreciate in a villain. However, the dude has essentially no personality, isn't even mentioned until the semi-final chapter of the game, despite being responsible for pretty much everything, and the game says how he used to be a kind and caring person before he was corrupted by power, which we see absolutely none of. Yeah, I can totally buy why Sarah believed there could still be good in Jingu when we see approximately none of it. He is completely overshadowed by Niski and Shimano for the majority of the game, and even when he does show up, he's basically an afterthought until right after the final boss against Niski. That said, there's something Kiwami adds that does absolute wonders for both its overall story and one of its villains. The Niski scenes. At the end of several chapters, you'll see cutscenes of what it was like for Niski while Kiryu was in jail. He's disrespected by his underlings, constantly unfavorably compared to Kiryu, and he's struggling to provide funds for his little sister's surgery. This was a fantastic way to expand on Niski as a character. It also makes the final boss against him one of the best in the franchise, and not just for it being a fun fight, though it absolutely is that too. But it's also because we've known Niski as a friend to Kiryu, both in this game and especially in Zero. We've had Niski's back, just like he's had ours on several occasions. We know about the tragic circumstances that led to his change, and it makes the emotion behind this confrontation all the more powerful.
What further helps the emotion is the drastically different tone of For Whose Sake, the final boss music from the original game. Instead of it hyping you up for a beatdown, its somber and slow beginning sets up the tone of the fight as an emotional and dramatic fight instead, which it executes very well. On that note, so that we don't forget this time, unlike what happened in our Zero video, the remixes and original songs for this game are fantastic. The remixes provide much needed energy and improve the song on a composition level. The karaoke songs are handled pretty well. Even Bakimi Tai gets a pretty decent remix to match the somber tone of Nishiki and Kiryu's broken friendship. Basically, a well done soundtrack for this game. So yeah, now we talked about the music outside of the final thoughts this time. Hooray! Now where's Kirby?
You drank the sun booze, didn't you?
Look, you can't just leave alcohol unattended and expect me to not go for it.
Yeah, but the drink turns you into a Chris, clearly. Let that be a lesson. Don't touch the drinks of someone who's immune to high heat.
So, our thoughts on Yakuza Kiwami are a tad bit more complicated than how we feel about Zero. While Zero delivered home runs in almost every aspect, gameplay, story, and side content, Kiwami is a lot more mixed in all of these aspects.
However, that doesn't mean it's bad. Absolutely far from it. Like Ryu's chances of getting with Yumi. Yakuza Kiwami is a good game. It just has those few cracks that prevent it from shining. It was a fun experience for the most part, and I'll probably play it again in the future, and it's absolutely a major improvement from the PlayStation 2 original. But it does have its flaws that prevent it from being as good as Zero. Still a great time though. Just less Majima Everywhere next time, please.
Now, since it's a remake of the first game, it works well enough as a starting point to the franchise, but I'd heavily recommend playing Zero first. Not just to serve as an introduction to several of these characters chronologically, but also how much more impactful the final fight against Nishiki becomes after you've played the game where he's your best friend. Overall, Yakuza Kiwami is still a great game. It being a remake of a 2005 game makes it come off as dated in a few places, and it definitely has its frustrating moments. But when the game's at its high points, god damn do they hit the mark!
Speaking of hits, yeah, Kiwami was successful for the series, and so after the release of Yakuza 6, the big-ass spoiler on the box, we got a remake of the second game. Hopefully that one will improve on the beast style after what happened here.
It does! If you count ditching the fighting stances altogether as improving it.
Motherfucker!
So tonight, 今夜もまた tonight ため息つ